morning and welcome to First Unitarian Church of Rochester. If you, like me, wanted to get up and dance, I hope that you did. It was a beautiful song. Thank you, Elizabeth Kricka, for your wonderful talents. Our mission here at First Unitarian is through spiritual connection and community. We listen deeply to others and ourselves. We open to wonder and transformation and serve together with love and humility. Today, we have the wonderful congregation of Saratoga Springs Unitarian Church who are joining us. We give you a very warm welcome and are so glad that you're with us today. After service, you'll have an opportunity to connect with our fellow youths from Saratoga through our conversation and connection hour. And please stay for that. Also after service today at 11:30, I'll be teaching UU 101. And if you'd like to join that, please look for the link in our chat. I'm Shannon Foose, membership coordinator here at First Unitarian, and leading worship today are Reverend Sherry Holiday Kwan, Reverend AJ Van Tyne, Emily Clasper, Elise Wall, Tommy Snell, and of course, Elizabeth Kricka that you already saw. Behind the scenes, as usual, we have our hospitality folks and our ushers making sure that we can all come together and have a great time. We also have on hand our chat chaplain, Elise Wall. So if you're having a hard time or you're worried about someone else, please feel free to reach out to her in the chat. Now, let's all take a deep breath as we enter into this sacred time and place. Please join me in saying our chalice lighting words. May the flame we now kindle inspire us to use our power to heal with love, to help with compassion, to bless with joy, and to seek liberation in the fullness of community.
A few weeks ago, I went ziplining for the first time. A friend of mine had been wanting to go, and knowing that I was a bit of an adventure seeker, he was hoping to borrow a little bit of my confidence. So he invited me, and he called the company. He had a lot of questions. How fast did the zip lines go? Did it matter how much you weighed? Does it matter how tall you are? Have there been any deaths? Have there been any injuries? Who's likely to get injured on something like this? I have perhaps an overabundance of confidence that the adventure industry does not want me to sue them. And I had very little control over the matter. I knew that once I get zipped into the line, so to speak, there was really nothing I could do but fall. My friend, his questions appropriately answered, booked our trip. Once we arrived, he repeated that same series of questions, but with new questions. What kind of training did the instructors have? What was the best way for him to prepare? Were there specific dietary needs that he should have addressed in advance? Would there be a bathroom available? Once we got into the van to get to the lines, to my embarrassment, he had more questions. What kind of material was the equipment made out of? Who invented zip lining? The questions range from the immensely practical to the philosophical. What should he think about as he's flying, hurtling through the air? Only you can determine that, our instructor wisely informed him. Once we were zipped into the lines, he had many questions, and I had none. And once we were flying hundreds of feet in the air, 45 miles an hour, hurtling towards a rock face, he was having the time of his life. Bored. The view was lovely, spectacular, but not that different than what I had seen from the precipice. And the wind rushing through my hair was lovely, but not that different from hanging my head out the window of the car, which is actually way more dangerous than ziplining. But my friend, who had had so many questions, who came with a sense of uncertainty and curiosity, Well, ziplining was a richer experience for him than it was for me, who came with an abundance of confidence and not enough curiosity. And I think this is why we come to church. We come to church because we know that questions and a deepening of our experience is possible in this community. We know that being curious means that what life has in store for us is bigger than it would be otherwise. We come because friends of ours, those who are around us, have a different approach than we might whenever we engage in something new. And so, welcome to our question service. Reverend AJ and I will be doing our best to answer theological and spiritual questions from all of you. Some of you submitted them in advance, but each of you has a chance now to also slide one question under the wire today. I invite you into the chat to type a question, and if we have time, we'll try to answer it today. It's good to be with you all. Come, let us sing together.
I invite you now to join me in voice, body, and spirit as we sing our opening hymn, Where Do We Come From? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Now we're going to sing it as a round. You are welcome to follow any of the three parts. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery, life is a riddle and a mystery.
Questions by Rachel Richardson. If there's one true thing, it's that Google will make money off of us no matter what. If we want to know what percentage of America is white, as it seems we do, what percentage the population is gay, as it seems we do, what percentage of the earth is water, the engine is ready for our desire. The urgent snow is everywhere, is a line by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And many of us have asked, apparently, where am I right now? Also, when will I die? Do You Love Me might be up there, generating high cost per click, but not as high as How to Make Pancakes. What time is it in California? So many things I wanted to ask you now that you're gone, and your texts bounce back to me undeliverable. Praise to the goddess of the internet search who returns with her basket of grain, 67,000 helpful suggestions to everything we request. How to solve a Rubik's Cube, what to do when I'm bored, how old is the earth, how to clear a cache, what animal am I, why do we dream, where are you now? Come back.
Asking the Way by Ko Un. You fools who ask what God is should ask what life is instead. Find a port where lemon trees bloom. Ask about places to drink in the port. Ask about the drinkers. Ask about the lemon trees. Ask and ask until nothing's left to ask.
An excerpt from Letters to a Young Poet by Rainier Maria Rilke. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer.
Each week at First Unitarian, we ask each of you to engage in our spiritual practice that we engage in collectively of generosity. We ask each of you to give to our Sunday offering, which each and every week we split with a community organization doing work that is in line with our mission as a spiritual community. This week, we are splitting our Sunday collection with Our Community Bikes. This volunteer-led organization gives out over 2,000 bikes to people who use bicycles as their primary mode of transportation. Each and every year, this organization does free repairs to over 3,000 bikes. This way of connecting each other from place to place, from person to person, aligns with the ways in which we connect from hearts to hearts and spirits to spirits here at First Unitarian. And so I invite you now to give through Venmo or Simple Church or by sending us a check. I invite you to engage in this spiritual practice of generosity.
I invite you now into a time of meditation, reflection, and prayer. I invite you to get comfortable and grounded in your body. Close your eyes if that is comfortable. Perhaps plant both feet on the ground so you may be connected to the earth in that way. And I invite you to simply begin by noticing your breath in and out, and noticing your heartbeat beating always for you, supporting you and sustaining you. Your breath and your heart may hold some of the joys and the sorrows from your life this week or this month. They may hold the great triumphs we are excited to share with others, and they may hold deep, deep grief. But our breath and our heartbeat are always there for us. So I invite you to a few moments of simple quiet and listening to our breath and our heartbeats. Returning to where you are, slowly opening your eyes. I offer you in prayer these words from UU religious educator Sophia Lyon-Foz. We gather in reverence before the wonder of life, the wonder of this moment, the wonder of being together so close yet so far apart. Each hidden in our own secret chamber, each listening, each trying to speak, yet none fully understanding, none fully understood. We pause in reverence before all intangible things that eyes see not, nor ears detect, that hands can never touch, that space cannot hold, and time cannot measure. There is never an end to our yearning to know the unknown. After all our labor at learning, there is never an end to our trying the untried. Fling wide the windows, O my soul. The bright beams of morning are warm.
Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. The bright beams of morning are warm.
The wonder of this life.
Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows.
The wonder of this moment.
Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. The bright beams of morning are warm.
The wonder of being together.
Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. Fling wide the windows, oh my soul, oh my soul. The bright beams of morning are warm.
Forgot about the closing scene. One of the dangers of being back in the sanctuary is I have to remember to turn on my mic.
Oh, yes.
But it's good to be here with you, Reverend
It
AJ.
is wonderful to be here.
So it's our question service, and I would like to start off by asking you a question.
Excellent. Please
It's a
do.
question that's important to me. It's a part of my sort of spiritual grounding. And it's also a question that draws sort of equally from a fellow minister, Mr. Rogers, who is a Presbyterian minister, and then somebody that both of us studied with in seminary, Cornell West. So the question is, who loved you into being?
Well, the briefest and shortest version of that is Unitarian Universalists, but that's not a very complete answer.
like the
So,
answer.
more specifically, I really grew up at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Fairfax in Oakton, Virginia. That was the sort of first UU religious community where I was in middle school and high school and coming into my own. Certainly the, many of the adults and adult advisors for the youth group come to mind, the other youth themselves, that community. I also did the regional, or at that time, district youth con conferences, weekend lock-ins. That community was very formative in really one of my first expressions or understandings of the radical hospitality and, beautifully affirming positive UU culture that we can have, especially when we listen to our youth and empower them to lead and make their own decisions. So that was a very formative community and culture for me. And in my undergrad experience, I did campus ministry, and that community, there wasn't one when I showed up. I worked to form one. So I was in sort of a leadership position in that community, but also was very much being formed by that experience and by those peers and by the UU, the professor who was happened to be a UU and was a professor of religion and philosophy, which was my major. That community of learning and of care and of spirituality was incredibly formative to me. And then, certainly both my parents as very dedicated UU lay leaders raising me, and in fact, my wife Ada is also a lifelong UU, and her parents and her congregation, which is down near where I went to college, also sort of I have the blessing of two UU families to really love me into being.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so likewise, I'm starting with a question for you, and my question for you, which also is a question that is one that I often am asking myself and working through. What is something that you learned either as a child or as an adolescent, maybe even a young adult, but as you were being formed by society, what is something that you've learned that you've had to unlearn as an adult, or as you've had ministerial formation, you've realized you needed to untrain your brain?
No, I asked you a question about the people around you, and you asked me one about like the sort of deep recesses of my soul. That's fair. Yeah. Okay, so it is a really good one though, and I appreciate the question. So something that I have had to unlearn as an adult that I learned as a child, and I think I've done considerable learning around it, but I believe I have probably a ways to go, is as a child who felt really deeply, who had undiagnosed and therefore unmedicated, untreated ADHD, and who was just deeply curious with the world. I had really big feelings, sadness, anger, and somewhere along the way, I learned that I was going to need to hide those away. And in fact, like it would be just better if I didn't have them at all. And I think that that was something that I learned that at times was explicitly told to me, but also just that it's inconvenient, right? And as an adult, having a different set of skills and a different framework to understand that feelings like guilt and anger and sadness, all of those can be incredible teachers. And we still get a lot of choice about what to do with them. But I would say that spiritual practice from Buddhist traditions and Unitarian Universalism have really helped me unlearn that earlier learning.
Hmm.
And again, I think I probably have a ways to go. So thanks for that question.
Thank you for the answer. All right, and now some of the questions that were submitted to us online ahead of time. We'll start it off easy with a very common, I think easy, a common question that UUs will ask. As UUs, and this is from, should I say Marin?
Sure.
Yeah, Marin and Jonathan. Marin, apologize. As UUs, why do we still call it worship? What are we worshiping? When we get together for Sunday for worship, what are we doing? And I love this question because for me, it digs deep to the question of language and religious language and what do we mean by the words that we say? And I guess I want to preface it by saying that something I believe and experience firmly, especially in UUism, is that to a certain extent, we are each speaking our own theological language, and we may not mean the same things by the same words, right? People may use the word God. 10 different people might have 12 different definitions for the word God, especially among UUs. So there probably is something similar going on there with worship. To answer that question more directly, I turn to the etymology. It comes from sort of Old English something or other. I'm not going to attempt a pronunciation, but something that basically means worthship or to ascribe worth to and value to. And so while certainly the history of the word worship in Western religion and Christianity is that you are worshiping and adoring the object of God or the deity. When I think of worship and being raised UU and just having that term applied to what we did on Sunday mornings, it didn't automatically seem to me that we were worshiping an object, but we were coming together in a community to sing, to tell stories, to talk about our values, to lift up our values and what was most important for us, and to try to create a space and a time that could lead to some religious experience, some spiritual transformation, right? Ideally, when I come to worship on Sunday morning, I don't want to leave those doors that I came in the same exact person. I'm hoping to have some kind of awakening or transformation, even if only in a very small way. And that's where my train of thought has left me. But I think that's a pretty complete answer. So
I think that's a great answer. Absolutely. So you said it was a pretty easy one. It's a really good question, but I do feel a little bit like we're going from 0 to, or like 10 to 180 in terms of what this next question is. This question comes from Rich, and he writes, it looks like the human race is not going to be dealing with global warming in any sort of meaningful way. So how do we as Unitarian Universalists deal spiritually with the climate crisis? Rich writes, P.S., I'm not going to be there. So, it's a funny ending, but a deep and important and meaningful question that I think lots of us would like to ignore. I think your premise is correct, Rich. I think the scientific community largely has consensus that human derived climate change can be mitigated at this point, but it cannot be stopped. The impact of that cannot be changed entirely. And so many of us, I think of you, AJ, and you and Ada coming to Rochester, essentially leaving California as climate migrants, right? And for people who are younger than us, I think a lot about what their lives might be like. But for people that are older than us, I also think about, what is it that we need to be teaching, instilling in future generations? What are the preparations we need to be taking now? Some of these are practical. So, for example, as a Unitarian Universalist community here in Rochester, we don't currently have air conditioning. I think probably this building should be retrofitted with air conditioning at some point, because at some point, that's going to equip us to save lives by being a community resilience hub where people can stay cool when it gets really hot. That's a very, very practical thing that we can do as a community. But I name it because I think that this is what Unitarian Universalism has to offer to us spiritually. The ways in which we tap into the very best of our humanism, the very best of our focus on community and the ability for each of us to have an impact is what we are called to now as we stare down climate change. I think it is easy upon realizing that climate change is already happening and extreme weather events are already playing out around us. It is easy to tip into despair, to think, well, we've ruined it, and maybe humankind wasn't quite so good after all. And there may be some truth to that, but we all have had plenty of experiences in which we have not been entirely good, in which we've made a mistake. And the idea that the response is important, the idea that there's an opportunity for some sort of repair or some sort of meaning making is the sort of long view that spiritually I think we are called to take. So as Unitarian Universalists, I think we're equipped with a few different things that isn't unique to our community. They aren't unique to our tradition, but a capacity for truth telling and holding complex truths is something that we'll need to rely on going forward. Being able to courageously look at inconvenient facts and know that we may have to reimagine the world is something that I believe we can do in community. I think that as we look at what the impact of climate change is likely to be, we're likely to see that local community becomes really important. And so the social networks of a church, things that we already practice by being in community together, will become even more important in a more extreme climate situation. The idea that we gather to pay attention weekly, to give worth to stories and songs and teachings that will bring us hope, that we can carry in our pockets and our hearts, that will move us through the next chapters. These are the things that I think spiritually we are wrestling with right now. So, Rich, to your point of, I may not be there when the crisis comes, you are already here and the crisis is coming. And so what are you called to do, Rich? The stories and teachings and songs of our tradition that will bring hope, that will teach us how to create a world anew, is the task that I think each of us are called to right now. That was a big question.
Great answer. Our next question is also, I think, a big and weighty one, and related to living in a time of not just that crisis, but multiple crises, all interrelated and yet distinct. This question comes from Gretchen, and there's sort of two ways that she phrased it. One is, how do I tell the difference between resting and wisdom, the wisdom of resting, versus self-complacency? And then another way that she phrased it is, my struggle is that I'm aware of suffering out in the world. Once I'm aware of suffering out in the world, how can I address it at a level that I'm capable of and yet still continue on with my privileged life? Or maybe that just isn't possible. So there's a question here around having privilege and I think even just having the privilege of being able to enjoy rest and self-care, right? That in and of itself can be a privilege. And also doing the work to try and save the world, to repair the world, to ease the suffering of others. And of course, there is so much out there that no one human being can do it all, right? That would destroy that person from doing that. So where can we find the balance there? And I think for me, that it's sort of just thinking through the answer of how, doing your best and trying to be aware and just trying to move through things and do the best that you can. There can be a lot of feeling of guilt or shame around having privilege, and much of it which may be out of our control to have been assigned it or being given it, right? Some of it is tangible, some of it's intangible and social. And for me, I think there's a key that I found, which is not getting bogged down in feeling guilty or shameful about having it, but recognizing what I would feel guilty or shameful about is not doing something either with that privilege and that ability to do something to ease the suffering of some others, and also not allowing that guilt and to drive me to not do enough, or just get bogged down in that and be thinking about my own privilege and how unfair it is and how unfair the world is, because that is not what I believe the world is asking me to do or calling me to do. It's asking me to see the suffering and do what I can from the position that I find myself in. And there is a piece, I think, around finding ways to dismantle and give up that privilege, right? It's not as easy to just say, oh, well, I renounce this privilege, or please treat me differently, or whatever it may be, right? But if it's something really concrete like financial resources, right, we can be very intentional and make bold decisions about what we do with the financial resources that we have, as an example.
Yeah, it's an immensely complicated and good question that really drives, I think, at the heart of what it means to be a faithful you, right? The question is essentially, and I don't want to put words in Gretchen's mouth, but I think a lot of us are asking, am I good? Am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Right? And there's this reality that just psychologically, we feel losses more than we do gains, right? So to your point of, if one is born into particular circumstances, one can make bold choices to give it away, right? And yet when you equalize circumstances, it's going to feel more dramatic for the person who has known something different and then chosen to move away from that or had it taken from them in some fashion, right? We see that reaction in lots of ways, politically and socially, but also we know it in ourselves. You know that, like, I do not have a cucumber in my hand, and yet if I did and you took it from me, I'd be pretty mad about it. That's a really trite way of putting this, but you said something about, like, I don't think the point is to feel guilty or shame, and I love that, because I think it brings a fine point to what we talk about when we talk about self-care, right? There's this idea that we only care for ourselves in order to take up the work. And quite frankly, I don't believe that. We also care for ourselves because we are also worthy and should enjoy life, that life is for enjoyment, right? And it is a fallacy that only people with incredible wealth can enjoy life, right? Enjoyment comes in all sorts of ways. And so if we are at any point in our lives, regardless of our circumstances, unable to tap into the things around us that are able to bring us joy and nourishment, there's something wrong, right? That is not a better outcome for the human spirit. And your point of one can make bold choices, I do think there is also this aspect of, it is one thing to care for oneself. It is another thing to put incredible distance between yourself and suffering, right? Or proximity to other people, when we find ourselves moving towards human relationship, when we find ourselves moving towards celebrating difference, when we find ourselves moving towards a world that is more equitable, then that feels to me like we're probably on the right track. There's also a tricky piece here where there's a saying that if you always know what the right thing to do is, you're probably not deep enough in the work.
Mm.
And I really believe that. I think if we knew exactly what to do in all instances of suffering and injustice, we would have done them. And quite frankly, humanity just isn't there yet. So the idea that there's discomfort and tension and lack of clarity, it doesn't mean that we're stuck there, but it does mean that that's a place for us to move through. So, Gretchen, I don't know if we got you any closer to the answer there. It's a big and deeply important question, and I'm grateful for it. I hope we can tackle it in some other ways. But, well, let's go from that to the classic question, essentially, of why do bad things happen to good people? Christy and Stefan and others, you wrote about circumstances in your lives where incredibly lovely, worthy people, people who you adore, people who you would not want anything bad to happen to, something has happened. Sometimes that's death, sometimes it's violence, sometimes it's just bad luck. But why do bad things happen? And how does Unitarian Universalism and our spirituality help us wrestle with that? So I'll take a stab at it. If you've got anything to add, I'd welcome it. But sometimes in Unitarian Universalism, I think we are tempted to say, we don't wrestle, we're too enlightened to wrestle with the question of why. That's for people who suffer. And well, the truth is, of course, we do suffer. And when your life has come crashing down around you, we do ask the question why. In the ER, at traffic accidents that are significant, with families, I hear people ask why all the time. Why does this happen? And unfortunately, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us. But what, as Unitarian Universalists, are we to do with it? The question you asked earlier about what did I need to unlearn, that's part of it, which is to say there's no neat and tidy way, no elegant way to process and then digest extreme suffering and pain very quickly and then move past it. We don't get to be terribly enlightened. We have to live in it and know that it will be challenging. And we have resources to draw on in that. We have community, a place to come, to cry, to lay down your burdens. We have people to talk to who may have gone through something similar, or maybe just know what it's like to experience loss or surprise. We have songs, we have stories. Sometimes, as you said in your prayer, we simply return to our grounding and our breath to know that our pulse is there and that we will be here in this moment until this moment becomes the next moment. Sometimes it is as simple as one step at a time or 1 second at a time. What we often turn to, and there's good reason for it, is to look for the helpers and to look for the power and the meaning and the love that can be created afterward. When the unthinkable happens, people around us surprise us constantly. Places of connection where people are able to shift out of the ordinary because something extraordinary has happened, and where there has been incredible suffering, demonstrate also incredible love. That's what we are aiming for in Unitarian Universalism. Is it terribly pithy? Will it bring you instant solace when you're at your loved one's deathbed? I don't think so. I think the randomness of the universe sometimes deals us a hand that we would prefer to not have. And what we do with it, and the ways in which we place ourselves in community and use the resources around us that's how we're best able to weave meaning.
What I would say, and I think is maybe a version of what you're saying, or certainly goes along with it, is around what Unitarian Universalism offers in these contexts, and that question of meaning making. And we are not a tradition that says, well, here's the meaning, here's how you understand any kind of tragedy or evil that happens. We are on collective and individual journeys of meaning making. And so while we don't offer a direct answer or a simple thing tied up with a bow, we offer that community of meaning making. And I guess what I want to say is that even though the universe is random and chaotic and meaning may be very elusive and the answers may not be satisfying, that doesn't mean that there aren't moments or times of making meaning. Sometimes people in suffering do find their way that they make meaning of it. And again, two Unitarian Universalists who have a similar tragedy may make meaning in entirely different ways. And so again, and to me, that is more the promise of what Unitarian Universalism has to offer, because we think that the way that truth works and the way that reality works is that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer that will comfort people or make meaning in all times of crises. But what we do offer is that there is a process, an approach that is very community-based, that is very questions-based, that does not guarantee answers, but guarantees a companionship of that questioning, that meaning-making, and even that just human empathy and being together. That we think that process and that approach is more true and more important and may get you to more of those meaning makings than if we were to say, oh, well, here we have the answer for you.
You know, it can sound really unsatisfying to say, okay, well, we're not going to give you an answer. And that, that's fair. But where I find my solace and take comfort and make meaning in the face of suffering is that process, that community, that model that you offer. It's something that's experienced, right? You know, when you are in a room and people who haven't spoken in 30 years are coming together because there's some sort of crisis, and this is the invitation to repair. You know, when somebody offers a sweet, simple offering of a baked good on your doorstep, it's maybe not as intellectually satisfying as a very prescribed cosmology that helps you weave meaning for all time out of it. But I take solace in the fact that we get to experience it in the here and the now, and we know and participate in it. So
if I may make an attempt at being pithy, I may be saying that we won't give you an answer, but we do think that you will find answers. It's not saying you won't encounter or have an answer, but we just not given by the tradition on high.
And you got to participate.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we've got time for, it's a big question, but one question from the chat, and it's a combination. It starts with, how is racial justice a spiritual practice? And that came from Ruth. But I'm going to connect it to something that Pamela said about racial harm in congregations and what does healing look like in that respect. So racial justice as a spiritual practice for me is a deeply exciting invitation to talk about something that I'm passionate about, but also that I think Unitarian Universalism has a lot to say about and is deeply participating in. So race is one of the constructs of social identity that we carry with us. Part of the American story, that is to say the United States of American story, is one of great racial animus, one in which groups based on race, namely through the displacement and genocide of the indigenous peoples and the enslavement of people from the African continent, right? Racial animus has been a part of the American story, right? I think what's the phrase that's often used that is pithy, but right, that this is a country built on stolen land by stolen people. There's no way to tell the American story without race. There's no way to tell the story of Unitarianism without race. No way to tell the story of Universalism without race. No way to tell the story of Rochester or Monroe County without talking about race. to tell a full story of any of those includes bringing a lens around different racial groups and how racial ideology and racist actions played into that. I know that part of my upbringing involved race. I know that I watched TV and I saw certain kinds of people and didn't see other kinds of people. I know that in my neighborhood, I was exposed to people from certain communities and not from other communities. I know that whether or not I was talking about it, race was a part of my upbringing. So when we talk about who loved you into being, there's a racial element to that, right? And so race impacts our relationships here in the community. It impacts my very spiritual being. It impacts my soul. And so when we talk about racial justice, there are sort of two elements. We talk about both the societal one. What does it mean to advocate for legislation in Albany or participate in a protest? But we also talk about, I think, the racial identity formation and the learning and unlearning that has to happen for us here on a spiritual level that involves our own learning and our own connections and community and relationships. So for me, racial justice is a spiritual practice for a number of reasons. One, it forces me, like worship, to pay attention to the things that are important, right? To pay attention to the things that impact my community, to pay attention to the things that impact my very soul. So to ascribe to a discipline of participating in racial justice means that I'm doing the deep soul work of unlearning some deeply rooted things in myself and learning and creating new spiritual frameworks for myself. And then on a wider scale, as Unitarian Universalists, we believe we can help bend the arc. We believe we can help transform the world. And so participating in that is a way to inform what it means for me to be a part of this community. Does that resonate with you? Anything you'd add?
Absolutely. No, so not anything I would add, because
Okay.
that feels very complete and yes, resonating. But what I would, what I was thinking of and what I feel like I want to share is the part of the theological framing and the way that I consider it, which is very similar to what you said, but it also connects back to that question of, well, what is UUism and what are we doing, right? We may have multiple truths among the people who are part of our community, but as a community, and the reason that we have uphold religious freedom and individual conscience and all these things is because we think that's the best way to get to the truth. We are still, I would say, like every other religious tradition on earth, ultimately concerned with the truth, knowing what it is, understanding what it is as best as we can, and responding to it, right? Doing what is good and ethical and in line with the true, like capital T truth. And the realities of racism and systemic oppression and the histories of slavery and genocide and all those things are antithetical to truth. They require us in the first place, they require human beings to deny the truth of our equality, of our shared humanity, to deny that in order to do those horrible things, and then to maintain those structures of power, and that imbalance requires even more and more lies, right? So it requires a kind of lie in the first place to establish this upended oppressive hierarchy, and it requires even more lies to maintain it. And right back to that question of who forms us and what do we need to unlearn, right? A lot of my formation, even my formation and identity as a white person, I've realized over my adolescence and adulthood and everything, it's a lot of lies. And it's a lot of lies to like unearth and uncover, and lies that I end up repeating and telling to myself. And that's not like a fun experience to unlearn and do all that. But again, this is where that piece of the guilt and shame piece really operates to, when I've leaned into that or allowed that to become more alive, I do less process. I am less able to find the truth and less able to get out of the lies and become more self-absorbed or whatever it may be. And when I'm more able to acknowledge maybe some of the feelings of guilt and shame, but sort of set them aside and say, okay, but what is the truth and what do I really need to do and respond to here? Then I am more able to break through the lies and find that truth and serve that truth and respond to it. And so that's sort of both that framing for me of like of truth and lies, right, is both that unlearning and that personal work and that soul rebuilding work, or whatever we might call it. And that larger systemic piece of like, hey, the way the laws are written, are in such a way that it denies the shared humanity of all people, or whatever it may be, or our education system, right? Not necessarily teaching the full truth all the time. So that for me is the big framing of that all spiritual activity, all religious activity is part of seeking and serving the truth. And as you said, if you're doing that almost anywhere in the world, but certainly in America, and certainly in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, like in context, race is going to be part of that conversation.
And conscious of the time, I'll take a few things that you said, because you mentioned unearthing those lies is not fun. And before, when we were talking about suffering and pain and processing that, one of the things you offered was this model of working that meaning out in community. So we talk about racial harm and racial healing within our congregations. I want to acknowledge that often those feel like the hardest conversations. Those feel really deeply personal. They involve people we know, but they also, I think, are challenging for us because there's this sense of moral injury. There's this sense that we have acted outside of our own principles and morals. So as somebody who maybe has been asked to consider whether or not their behavior is working toward the beloved community, working towards a place that is equitable for all races, a place where Unitarian Universalism can truly be a multiracial and multicultural context. I think if you're having to grapple with the fact that you maybe have not contributed to that fully, that can hit you really hard, because of course, aren't we an anti-racist congregation? Isn't this what we care about? And I think especially if you're a person of color, there's also this sense of moral injury where, in order to be a part of this congregation, have I done things that I wouldn't normally do? Is that the kind of person I want to be? Are those the kind of conversations that I just let slide, right? So it hits us at this deeply personal place that it's so easy to trip into and trigger shame, right? As Unitarian Universalists, we hold out our model for meaning making as wrought in community. This idea of relationship being the context for repair and for healing. If that's how harm is done between people, then that's also how restoration has to be done between people. It's not easy work by any means, but I think that is one of the promises, and quite frankly, the responsibilities, one of the scarier responsibilities for our congregations, for our community, is that this then becomes a community of practice, of spiritual practice. But what I mean by that is literally returning again and again to something we're not good at yet. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, I've got, I think, 1,000 more questions and answers for you, but Revelation is not sealed. Our story continues. And I think that is all for our questions today.
I invite you now to join me in singing our closing hymn, Wo Ya Ya, led by Sasha and Cole, two of our youth.
And the Lord will
Please join us in saying our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
May we go out into this week, into this world, asking questions full of curiosity, seeking the truth, and hearing answers, finding them wherever they may come. I love you. May we go in peace. Amen.